Welcome, everyone. I'm Spiro. Thanks for tuning in. Now, we've been covering many aspects regarding the pandemic of COVID-1984. Now, one very important aspect that I have not really touched on, which is detrimental to life as we know it, is food. And Henry Kissinger once said, control oil and you control nations. Control food and you control the people. Now, to help shed some light on the current situation, I'm very happy to be joined today by Christian Westbrook, who is an independent researcher and creator of the Ice Age Farmer broadcast, which documents long-standing agendas to collapse our food supply and replace it with synthetic foods. Christian focuses also on how to build food security for your family and within your community, and has recently launched the victoryseeds.org to help spread that message as people become aware of the new challenges that we face. Christian, thank you for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you, Spiro. Thrilled to be here.
A big fan of your work, and I have to give a shout out to my friend Don, who turned me on to your work, and I definitely, it's an extremely important topic that we're going to dive into here today. Now, first, we had seen the great toilet paper shortage of 2020 when this first started to hit Western countries, and people were freaking out about the toilet paper. Now we're seeing food production facilities being closed down, they claim, due to the spread of the virus. We have seen many people lining up for miles in the food bank lines, and burger joints such as Wendy's removing burgers from their menus because of the meat shortages. At the same time, fake meat has been hitting the markets, which of course is funded by the likes of Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and others. But right now, it seems that we may be on the downside of this so-called outbreak, at least for now, until they ramp it up again for this second wave that we keep hearing about. Now, can you tell us what is the current state of our food supply chain, and should we expect food shortages?
I can. And Spiro, let me just first thank you for the great work you've been doing as well. You know, I'm really glad that we have this opportunity to speak after you've had your conversation with David Icke and Dr. Tenpenny, because they've really set the stage with a lot of what we need to talk about today, and we can stand on the shoulders of giants and sort of start where they left off. We need to build on those conversations, because when we talk about mandatory vaccinations, when we talk about this immunization passport, right, the digital known traveler identity, the army of 20,000 contact tracers being hired in California, these things sound absurd. And as you said, it seems like it's on the down, we're sort of on the down slope. It feels energetically, at least, like people are just turning the corner now. So what is going on with that mismatch of why are they ramping up efforts, especially in bluer areas, even as things seem to be on the way out? And we need to understand, we need to look a little bit ahead for those actions that they're taking now to actually make sense. And yes, it's true that you can only keep people in a state of fear for so long. And as that fear is wearing off now, as people, it's sort of giving way to frustration and just being tired of the whole thing. But we've already seen that their agenda has been laid out in the open. They've talked about the mandatory vaccines and not being able to travel without them. They've mentioned a lot of these things, like the contact tracing, that just sound way, way over and beyond what should ever be accepted by a free society. But what they need now is to give teeth to that agenda again, because the fear, like we said, the fear has worn off. And the way that they will achieve that, the teeth that we're describing here, is the food scarcity that we're entering into now, that they are engineering actively. And so what the state of the food supply is right now, as you said, there's a lot of it that's shut down. Mostly the meat, because it has the shortest pipeline, is being felt immediately. So as the central point of failure, these big meat packing companies, which we should hasten to add are largely, JBS is owned by Brazilian criminals, and Smithfield is owned by the Chinese Communist government. So we just have to point out there are many, many levels, and it's a long-standing agenda that has sold out our nation's food supply. It's just that, like all of the things we're mentioning, all of this is just in complete rush forward. Deploy this all right now, rolling it out in a blitz of all of these efforts. So the food supply, yes, with those central packers shut down, we're at like 60%, 50 to 60% of the current meat processing capacity. And so that does manifest as, yes, retail shortages and Wendy's not having burgers at their burger place, right? There's very immediate signs that something is wrong. And that's actually a good thing, because it gets people thinking. And that's one of the reasons that I really appreciate you having this conversation today, is because we need to have as much of this conversation as we can and get people, while their eyes are open, while they're feeling the pain suddenly of not being able to buy burgers, we need this information to get to them, or otherwise they'll just lay out the next leg of the agenda, as we've been discussing. So it does have those immediate consequences, but so too, and much more concerningly, does it mean that there are farmer ranchers who have, livestock that they've been growing out for months, years now, and that they can't get those to market, that there's no place to take them. And so not only are there immediate meat shortages that they're visible, you can actually see them, but like I said, more concerningly, farmers and ranchers are literally euthanizing and throwing away a lot of this across the board. Dairy and beef cows, hogs are especially hard hit because you can't just put them out to pasture, and so the whole 11-month pipeline is just sort of cascading and falling apart. And poultry, all of these are being euthanized to the tune of millions of animals right now, and it's an awful thing no matter which way you slice it at all. It's just a terrible situation. But most germane to this conversation is, yes, that means that not only are these immediate shutdowns causing immediate shortages, but it's not something that we can spin back up in the next 6 to 12 months. This is an enduring, lasting blow to our food production. And we can talk more about that. We can also look at, go ahead.
I just wanted to throw in there, Christian, why exactly are the farmers, just euthanizing livestock and other farmers, just literally pouring milk out into down the drain? Like, I mean, the demand hasn't changed. There's still people out there, who need to buy these things. Is it just because they've been closing down the production facilities and the processing facilities?
That's a good question and an important one. And there is a demand shock that happened as restaurants and school cafeterias closed down. A lot of milk and a lot of food. Restaurants waste a lot more food than homes too. So there was a change to demand somewhat, and mostly, of course, that demand, because people do eat every day, but mostly that means that demand shifted from those places where there were established contracts, right? Farmers have relationships with restaurants or school, whatever it is. All of those distribution channels had been established. And so when they faltered, there were all these farmers who had cows that were giving milk that had no place to take it. And it was, when you read about these things, people were often commenting, this is so selfish, or down with capitalism. They're just preferring, because they can't sell their milk, they're not going to give it away. That wasn't the case at all. These farmers and ranchers were taking every drop that food banks would take. And once they had, exhausted the food bank's ability to absorb this production that didn't have a place to home, then that was when they started dumping. So that's the case with the dairy. And then with the meat, like I said, it's more that without the ability to take those hogs and have them slaughtered and then take it to market, you're stuck with them. You're stuck with them in the barn, and you still have smaller pigs that are growing up that are supposed to go in that barn. And so they get into situations where they're double stocking and they're having to buy extra food because they have to feed the pigs longer. And then there's no place for the baby pigs to go. And that's why I say it's sort of this cascading effect, a cascading failure where at some point you either kill off the breed that was, the young pigs that were coming up next, or you kill off the current ones and then hope that 6 months from now this situation will have resolved. But there's, obviously neither of those is a terrific option for producers.
Now, Christian, it is amazing to see how this pandemic is meeting many goals of the United Nations 2030 Agenda and Agenda 21. Now, all of these same players are involved in managing this crisis, so to speak. Now, can you explain how this coming food crisis that we're experiencing the early stages of is not only engineered, but is playing right into this long-standing agenda going back at least 100 years?
Well, absolutely. Yeah, it is giving teeth to a lot of the points that they're trying to impose upon us. And it's important to look at some of the documents that the UN, especially the IPCC's land use report, openly puts out there. But again, like you said, this is an old agenda. And I always like to reference Lord Birkenhead's article in Cosmo, where he writes, we're going to get rid of animal agriculture. All of the cities will have, science will enable the cities of the future to grow their own lab meat and to grow crops indoors. And we will feed the countryside. And no longer, finally, thanks to science, will cities be a parasite on the countryside. We will finally invert that paradigm. So they have long imagined that, these smart cities, like you said, it all flows together. And so it almost becomes difficult to try and encapsulate it all in like a coherent thought. But yes, the smart cities will be where the food production is. It will be illegal. In fact, Lord Birkenhead said, agriculture as we know it will be a thing of the past. Maybe it will exist as a hobby for some rich people, but it's not going to be practiced in the civilized world. So ending animal agriculture, ending natural cultivation is absolutely part of this. And it makes sense when you look at the totality of this Agenda 21, the transhumanist agenda, is to separate us from everything that makes us human, to fundamentally change us. And food, if you think about it, is much more than sustenance. Really, it's part of our identity. It's who we are. It's deep in our culture, and everything that makes, look at all of the festivals and the foods that are associated with the harvest festivals. Different parts of how we live our life is intimately tied to the way that we have culturally fed ourselves, and that's just part of being human. And so that is naturally something that in a totalitarian transhumanist complete formatting of the human species, you would need to dissociate us from the food. You would need to get rid of the American freedom burger, right? Never again can we have those burgers outside on the grill. Now we have to have the lab-grown meat on the days, eat that Soylent on Tuesdays. And you will never remember that there was, such a thing as freedom fries or classical breast milk. This is part of separating us from who we are.
Can you provide just a couple of direct examples of how this agenda, what we're seeing right now with the food shortages, like which parts of the UN 2030 agenda specifically, like does this play into, and how Agenda 21?
Sure. So the desire to remove people from the land is absolutely spelled out pretty clearly, to get them into these shoebox multifamily apartments in cities where you can be perfectly controlled and you will not have the ability in any sense to grow your own food. So that's part of the reason they want people herded into these smart cities where you can be completely controlled in terms of how many resources you're able to consume. The agendas also spell out that we should be eating insect proteins instead of, again, ending animal agriculture. This is intimately tied in with the entire global warming scam. And all of these things are really encapsulated. It's important to look at also these scripts that are being played. When you see, for instance, yesterday it was announced that the cities across the United States, especially across the western seaboard, of Seattle, Portland, San Jose, San Francisco, all announced that they were closing streets, or that the streets they had closed in the last few weeks here would remain closed going forward. It's not a coincidence, Spiro, that all of these cities announce these things, that they say, we just happened on a Friday afternoon. All of us just got together with our city councils and we decided we'd never open our city again. It's not, it's completely inconceivable that that's the case. So clearly they are rolling out and implementing a template, a script that has been discussed before. And so those agendas are what spells it out. And it's just the case that over the past few years, we've seen the billionaires deploy their resources, the philanthropists, right, deploy their resources to execute on those agendas and to give life to the lab-grown meat that's been described for hundreds of years, and to the AI, robotic-controlled indoor vertical insect farms that the UN envisions feeding us tomorrow. All of these things are spelled out in their agendas. Over the last decade, if you reference some of these things that they're openly talking about, they sound so ludicrous that it's a handicap to us, because it's just no one could actually believe that these things would ever come to fruition. But now, especially in these last few weeks during this crisis, we see that they mean business. They're not writing these dreams up and then just putting it into a bookshelf somewhere. They are executing on this agenda, and they're doing it now.
Right now, they are, absolutely. And it's happening at an ever accelerated rate, especially as we've entered this new decade, as we approach 2030. Now, we have seen the rollout of AI and blockchain being used to track and trace everything. Currently, the United Nations is using these technologies to track pigs, for example. And if they can use them to track pigs, they can use them to track people. And we see this going in that direction. But can you explain how these new technologies will forever change the food industry?
Sure. So there's been a lot of buzz throughout ag tech and the rest of agriculture. I should just mention that ag tech is the unholy marriage of big tech and big ag. So you've got your huge, seed companies, the Monsanto Bayers, the Syngenta, which is now owned by Chinese state-controlled ChemChina. That's another huge component of our food supply that is completely controlled by the Chinese Communist government, which is ridiculous. It should never be the case. It's a national security problem there. one of the most obvious ones you could think of. All of these companies have been investing in these technologies right now, and that was the ag tech reference. And among them is the blockchain, and using it to completely track from the seed through to the plant that grows to how it gets to the store, the distribution channels, and then how long it's on what shelf. And the reason for this is generally called, it's always for your safety, right? It's in the interest of public health. And they'll look at some of these recalls and salmonella infections and things like this and say, well, if every piece of lettuce had a little ID on it and I could check my blockchain for exactly the provenance of this piece of lettuce, then I could find all other associated. I mean, it's basically contact tracing. We can just call it that now, contact tracing for vegetables. But this is what they envision, yeah.
Now, this entire system of control hinges upon dependency. We have been systematically, become more dependent on this system by design. Now, can you please tell us what can people do to regain their independence, and just how important it is to be independent from this system of control?
Absolutely. So the theme that ties most of these parts of their agenda together is the consolidation, the centralization of power. And that's because they sit at the center and they want total control over everything, total control over every aspect of your life and of your food, of all the resources from energy to food. And so in order to, the only rational response to an agenda like this being perpetrated is to try and fight it and try and then decentralize everything, right? Try and take it back out of their control into more local hands and into individual hands, into your own hands. Fundamentally, that's why we talk about being self-sufficient, because a distributed food growing method, like what does that actually look like? That means everybody's growing food, which is actually very much the traditional way that humanity did it before. Everybody was growing food, and if your harvest got flooded out, then you could go to your neighbors and get more seeds. We were all sort of there growing and eating together, and definitely people had bad years, but because so many people were growing and working together, that's the nature of a community. At the end of the day, net we get through. And that's not the case with this single point of failure like we're seeing with the meat plants. When you have one problem and everything depends on that single point of failure, it becomes an issue for the entire food supply.
Now, Christian, one last question here. What happens if we do nothing? If we just keep going down the same road that we're on and we do nothing at this point?
So let's look. Trump invoked the Defense Production Act, and some people are saying things are going to be fine. Well, the meat plants will be open right now. There's a huge caveat here, and that it is that invocation was subject to the CDC and OSHA guidelines. And so what's happening is, just as you've been describing, this limited reopening where it's not going back to normal at all. It's restaurants at 25% capacity, which means that a small business can't operate. You're going to go out of business. So too with a meat packing plant subject to CDC guidelines means social distancing on your production lines, and they're only reopening at 50, 60% production. So this is the other reason. It's not just that we're getting rid of all our livestock, but it's because we're reopening. And like I said, these foreign controlled companies don't care about us. So they're happy to serve only 50 to 60% of our meat, and they've already got their investments in the fake meat. So if we don't take matters into our, and Spiro, here's the real kicker. There are forces at work. There are unions, labor unions, the UFW, United Farm Workers, and other groups of activists, no doubt linked to Soros and other players like this. And then, of course, the media conspiring with all of their fear to create an environment where everything I just described about imposing these social distancing and these extra restrictions on the meat plants is also going to apply to farm producers, right? To all crops, specialty crops, everything. And so if you think then about what this looks like at the end of this season here, when you need harvest labor, you need those workers to come through and get the crops out of the ground and package them, clean them. There's a ton of work that goes into that, especially for smaller operations, smaller producers. And so the effect that is clearly going to happen here is the same thing. We're going to have reduced production out of each of those farm operations. A lot of them won't be able to survive if they don't have all of their fields working, or if they're not able to actually harvest all of their crops. And then, as far as the food supply, there will be shortages. This is when it becomes an absolute certainty. If we don't get some of these issues solved by the time that harvest season rolls around, then we're looking at a real nightmare here, a Holodomor 2.0, which is exactly the scarcity that they're trying to engineer to roll through with their agenda. So it's imperative that we raise awareness of what's going on and then try and strike some reasonable balance, because we can't just throw people into the machine and grind them if there's any danger, right? There's a legitimate call for public safety, but we can't completely decimate our food supply in the name of protecting farm workers. There's got to be a better way forward here. And, that wouldn't be a problem if we were all growing our food.
Now, what kind of time frame are we looking at here for people to really start to feel the hurt on this? Is it going to be the next harvest season? And what role are local governments playing in this, and governors? Are they having any impact?
Sure. So it's important to say that even before this whole virus outbreak, there were already shortages being felt. There were some canned food shortages last year, and other animal feed shortages here and there. It's been spotty in a number of ways. And that is because of the fact that we've been in this grand solar minimum, which is greatly affected, as it has every cycle throughout history, the 400-year cycle. You look back and, countries, empires would fall because their crops would fail. And so we remain in the midst of this right now. In fact, right now, there are snowstorms on the East Coast, right, that have been freezing out. A number of corn producers are taking to Twitter with pictures of their frozen corn and saying, this is going to be no plant 2020, which on the heels of No Plant 2019, massive crop losses last year, this is it's a cascading situation where we're building on problems we were really banking on this year to overcome last year. So all of these things mean that there are already, like we said, the meat missing is already a very visible sign of what's going on. And I would expect that these pain points, like I said, fits and starts, but it's going to get worse and worse over time.
Christian, tell us about your work over at victoryseed.org.
Yeah, so thevictoryseed.org is really a recognition that in the last few weeks, the world has changed. There are two things that are going on right now. They are trying to roll forward their agenda as quickly as possible with the element of surprise. And like we said, they knew what was coming, and they developed these scripts, these templates, and they're rolling them out all over as quickly as possible. And the counterforce, us, right, is watching and realizing in real time what's going on and then trying to respond. And so what we need to do, and what thevictoryseed.org is doing, is trying to get the word out there, trying to teach people that right now they need to be starting their own potatoes and vegetables and whatever else you want to grow, and more even than you have space for, because increasingly your neighbors and other people in your community are also going to start realizing what's going on. And if that's June or July, then it would be fantastic if we had some, potato starts ready to share with them, seeds ready to go, so that we can bootstrap as our communities and really get this forward. There were victory gardens back in World War II that we used to ensure our food security, and we need to get back to that. It's not just a gun behind every blade of grass that we need now. It's a victory garden in every household. And so that's what the victorygarden.org is educating and encouraging people to do. I've also just added, and this speaks to the other half of your question as far as what are local governments doing. I've added a couple examples of laws that, for example, Wyoming has just passed a House bill that says we don't need to go through the USDA's red tape if it's a direct sale, if it's an animal share. They just added, it's super easy to do. There's all this legalese, but then they just say, okay, cut through. This is an emergency right now. We need meat. If it's a direct sale from producer to consumer, forget the USDA. It's not subject to any of these regulations. And so that's passed, and that's awesome. That is a huge victory that improves quality of life and food security for everybody there. And so I posted that to thevictoryseed.org as an example, because as we said, they have their templates, right, that they're rolling out everywhere. And so here's something good that we can do where we are. And if we take that, the way that they've done that, just carving out an exemption for direct sales from producers to consumers, then all of us should be trying to get that done at whatever level we can, municipally, at the county, or at the state if possible. Wyoming did great. There's another example out there which speaks to the immunization part of things, and it's not passed, but it's a bill that was drafted to modify language that currently requires students that are enrolling to get an immunization. And not only does the language in the new bill that's been proposed strike those requirements, but it actually then goes on to add language that says, never shall anyone attempt to require immunization to enter any access to access any public service. This is something that interferes with an individual's medical sovereignty. And so it's awesome to see any law drafted that kind of speaks to that. And building on Dr. Tenpenny's and your interview, that is something that I'd love to see. So I put that language up there on thevictoryseed.org as well. Again, just to provide examples, seeds, really, just to provide these seeds that we can all take to our communities and start doing, whether it takes all of us right now, Spiro, whether it's growing food, which we can and all should do, or, if you're a web person, then you can reach out to farmers and producers in your area and offer to establish a shopping cart site for them so that they can get those channels back up, especially if they have lost access to their market. They need someone to help them stand up something so they can keep selling their product. Or if you're a lawyer, like I just said, we need help drafting this language and injecting it into the legal code of each municipality or county or state. We need people to reach out to sheriffs. Whatever it is you do, whatever experience you have, I promise you, we need you right now. This is all in. And as people realize the depth of the crisis and the economic collapse, the world, when we say the world has changed, it's just impossible, I think, yet to even fully appreciate how much that's the case.
I believe you're right. And can you tell us where exactly is that immunization reform? Is that in a certain state, or can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that was South Dakota's House Bill 1235, which, as I said, is proposed but not passed. But I put a little picture of the way that, I like both of these examples because you don't have to be a lawyer to see what's going on. There's a little picture and it says you're required to have vaccine to go to school. And there's no big line through this. Never again will this be allowed. And so we have the ability to make changes like this to our legal system. And more importantly, Spiro, with 30 million people losing their jobs, with everything that's going on right now, meat shortages, we need not to underestimate the political willpower, right? People are realize that things have changed. And like I said, increasingly, they will realize about the economic just damage that's been done and how severe that is. And the need then to do things that are unprecedented, that would have seemed, that's what they're doing right now, is all of these things that would have been unimaginable only weeks ago. And so we have that power too, and we have to do this, or else, as you asked earlier, if we do nothing, we simply walk right into the script that they've written for us over hundreds of years now. And it's not a pretty ending. It's not one I want my kids to experience.
Christian Westbrook, thank you so much for being my guest today. You're doing some brilliant work, some very important work. I'm a big fan of it. People can find your work over at the iceagefarmer.com and thevictoryseed.org. Thank you again for being my guest here today, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you, Spiro. It's been an honor, and I appreciate your time.